So I'm Mark Engman, Director of Policy and Advocacy for Pure Earth. As many of you know, Pure Earth has been working on toxic pollutions and its impacts on children for 25 years. We've known for decades that lead poisoning is bad for people, especially children. But it's really been only in the past few years that we started to understand the enormous scale and impact of lead poisoning globally, particularly in lower and middle income countries. It was 4 years ago when UNICEF and Pure Earth published The Toxic Truth, the first real effort to estimate the number of children affected by lead poisoning. That study found that 1/3 of the world's children have elevated blood lead levels, more than 800 million kids, most of them in poorer countries. Our two speakers today have added critical research on the impacts of lead exposure globally, helping make the case that the world needs to treat lead poisoning as a global development priority. So I'm going to do brief introductions, and they're very brief compared to the resumes of these researchers, but I'm going to do brief introductions for both of them and then turn the floor over to them to do their presentations. After that, we'll have Q&A as time permits. Dr. Ana Navas-Acien is the incoming chair of Environmental Health Sciences at Columbia University's Mailman School of Public Health. Her research investigates the health effects of environmental exposures and effective interventions for reducing those health effects. She directs the Columbia University Northern Plains Superfund Research Program. She serves as a member of the National Cancer Advisory Board, and she was vice chair of the group that crafted last year's American Heart Association statement linking exposure to low levels of lead, cadmium, and arsenic to increased risks of cardiovascular disease. Thank you for being with us today. Bjorn Larsen is an international development and environment economist and a World Bank consultant. His research focuses on environmental health and natural resource management, including air pollution and lead and arsenic exposure. Over the last 20 years, he has developed more than 100 research and policy reports and papers and has 25 publications in professional journals and books. He's joining us from Laos today, so thank you for staying up late, and we look forward to hearing from you. We're going to start with Ana. Ana, you have your slides to share, so please share your screen and take it away. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Mark, so much for the introduction. Thank you to Bjorn for being here, also sharing the space with me and presenting together. And thank you to Pure Earth for organizing this session and really continuing to make this important work for us to address the issue of global lead poisoning. So I am going to share my screen. Let me go ahead, and I think I can. Very good. I hope everybody can see well the slides. So yeah, so my focus for this presentation is going to be really to really highlight the importance of lead, the lead impact on cardiovascular disease as one of the major forms of disease for humans, and really the main cause of death and morbidity globally. And to show how important lead is as a risk factor for cardiovascular disease. So I am going to I really like this cartoon that really manifests very clearly why lead is so important for adults, for adult populations. We know, everybody knows that lead is relevant for children. Unfortunately, those lead exposures accumulate in our bodies. Lead is a chemical that is toxic, is non-essential. We don't need lead for anything. And lead also was not really present in the surface of the earth as life evolved in the earth. This means because it's only through human anthropogenic activities, mining, smelting, that we have really spread lead pollution globally. Because lead, chemically, is very similar to calcium, it accumulates in the bone, and we cannot eliminate easily from the body. This means that over decades, lead is going to have, that lead accumulation is going to have the opportunity to interact and induce toxicity to multiple organs and systems. with one of them being the cardiovascular system. So this knowledge has really been consolidated very clearly in recent decades, in recent years. But this knowledge has actually been here for a very long time. But yeah, this has been the consolidation of this knowledge has been put together in this statement from the American Heart Association, which Mark mentioned at the beginning. I had the privilege to serve as co-chair for this statement. And this is important because this means that the American Heart Association acknowledge that lead is a risk factor for cardiovascular disease. So let's go a little bit about how do we know this? What is the evidence behind this knowledge? But as I briefly mentioned earlier, this has been known for a long time. At least hints of knowledge has been known for a long time. And the first paper I found is from 1881. It was an abstract presented at the International Medical Congress in London. And the abstract was actually written in French. And if you look at the translation, what it means is that when there is a lead toxicity in the kidneys, which has been well known also for a very long time, there is at the same time a thickening of the in the internal wall of the arteries, which is with nodules. And that's actually the description of atherosclerosis. When we have a thickening of the arteries, this is when we've developed atherosclerosis, and this is the most underlying common cause of cardiovascular disease, particularly myocardial infarction, what is best known as a heart attack. But also it says there is hypertrophy of the heart. And hypertrophy, ventricular hypertrophy or hypertrophy of the heart is often related also to blood pressure and high blood pressure levels. So this was described, and a very similar description is available also in this other paper from the British Medical Journal. Now it includes quite a number of cases, 107 cases, and the paper describes how there is this arterial thickening and degeneration, which is related to premature aging of the arterial system, hypertrophy and contraction of the muscular walls of the arteries. There is increased blood pressure, there is cardiac hypertrophy. So these studies are really remarkable. Unfortunately, that knowledge was kind of lost, and it's not only in more recent decades that experimental investigation and epidemiological studies have helped us understand how lead can be cardiotoxic. I mentioned earlier that lead shares many properties with calcium. This is why it goes into the bones. And this results in the interference of calcium signaling. Calcium is extremely important for many properties and human life. It's really a very important essential element. And actually, the interference with calcium is believed to be key for the neurotoxicity of lead. And it's also believed to be key for the cardiotoxicity. And through the substitution of calcium and other elements, essential elements such as zinc and copper, lead also interferes with the antioxidant systems, increasing oxidative stress and increasing inflammation and interfering with the proper functioning of the vascular system. Something very interesting to kind of recognize is that in the epidemic of lead exposure in the US, the peak in lead exposure was 1968 and in lead production. Interestingly, that year, 1968, also coincides with the peak in cardiovascular disease deaths. And in the United States, with the declines in lead exposure, in parallel, we can also see a decline in cardiovascular disease deaths. And this is really maybe remarkable, but not surprising, that in recent studies using data from the National Health and Nutrition Examinations Survey, which is known as NHANES, using those decades of information from NHANES, it has been estimated that a very important numbers of deaths to cardiovascular disease would have been related to lead exposure in the United States, and that this effect is 10 times higher. This is how it was summarized in this article in CNN. And this study published in Lancet Public Health was really very important, as it's really highlighted, and it made it really globally aware about the importance of lead exposure for cardiovascular disease. But let's dig in a little bit further in the epidemiological evidence underlying this association. This is from a systematic review published in the British Medical Journal in 2018, like 5 years ago. And in that systematic review, there were 10 studies looking at cardiovascular disease, 8 studies looking at coronary heart disease. And in that systematic review, putting all the evidence together, which was of relatively high quality, this was good studies in general, lead was associated with a higher risk. You can see for comparing the highest tertile versus the bottom tertile, there was a 43% for all cardiovascular disease and 85% increased risk for coronary heart disease. Not surprising that the association is stronger for coronary heart disease, because that's what's really related to atherosclerosis, which seems to be like one of the key pathways for lead exposure. This study is very interesting because it's one of the few studies available that has data on bone lead. Bone lead is difficult to measure. Normally, most epidemiological studies look at blood lead, which is easily accessible for epidemiological research. And bone lead, in this case, measuring the patella, you can see that the hazard ratio, the measure of risk, is substantially greater. Like, this would indicate that there is more than a 200% increased risk per unit of increase in lead exposure in the bone, as compared to the 40% increase when you measure it in blood. And this is important because it manifests that maybe this cumulative lead in the bone might be quite substantial and important if we were able to measure it. In this study, bone lead was measured through X-ray fluorescence, which is difficult to do. It requires radiation, and it requires like some technological issues that are limited for most studies. But the association of lead with cardiovascular disease, we don't have to wait until the full spectrum of clinical events has developed. We can see it with also already high blood pressure, heart rate variability, the left ventricular hypertrophy, as I mentioned earlier, plaque, atherosclerosis plaque in the carotid, or in the arteries of the lower extremities. So these are all early forms of cardiovascular disease that can be detected even in young adults. Sometimes even in adolescents, you can already see these effects, these associations. I am going to show you a study of what happens when you remove lead from the environment. You remove lead from the environment, your blood lead levels start to decline. What happens to your blood pressure levels? And this study, we did it in the Strong Heart Study, which is a study in American Indian communities across regions of the US. And in this histogram, we show the decline in lead levels, in blood lead levels over time, from the late 90s to the mid 2000s. And you can see that the decline is mostly positive because most people have lowered their lead levels. There has been an important decline due to public health interventions. And this decline was related to a decline in blood pressure levels. You can see that this decline is around, even 10 milligrams of mercury lower systolic blood pressure levels. If you compare people who have declined around 3-4 micrograms per deciliters of lead, which is, you know, a substantial decline, versus people who didn't decline at all. So that's a clinically relevant change. This is remarkable because it shows that lowering lead, you can see a decline and improvement in your blood pressure levels. But the question is, okay, beyond the decline in blood pressure levels, can you see the benefit of lowering lead? Can we see the benefit for improving cardiovascular deaths? So this is what the work that was led by Maria Tellez Plaza and Ruiz Hernandez, using the data from NHANES over several decades of NHANES information. And what the study found is that of the 231 deaths for cardiovascular disease that have been prevented over time in NHANES, 22% of this decline was due to lead reductions. And this estimation is actually beyond changes in blood pressure levels, which means that even though, yes, we found that reducing lead can improve blood pressure, you can even see further improvements beyond blood pressure, probably through atherosclerosis development that helps prevention of cardiovascular disease. So this is very compelling data. The question is, what can we do to lower blood lead? And of course, public health interventions is the most important. But I had the privilege to work with Dr. Tony Lamas in a clinical trial of lead chelation, of metal chelation, called the TACT2 study. And in that study, you can see the median levels. This is in micrograms per liter, not micrograms per deciliters, as I showed earlier. But you can see how the median levels in the placebo group are around 9 micrograms per liters, which would be 0.9 micrograms per deciliter, around 1 microgram per deciliter. So this is very low levels. This is participants recruited in between 2016 and 2020. So this is a time in history in the US where lead exposure is extremely low. And these are actually similar to NHANES levels. And you can see that the people who received the placebo no decline absolutely, as expected. However, the people who got the treatment, and these are repeated chelations, baseline infusion 5 of DTA, 20 and 40. And now you can see that there is a very dramatic decline. There is an important change through the treatment. This suggests that we have an alternative way of lowering lead exposure, blood lead in communities, in individuals, beyond the public health interventions, which of course are the priority. And so this is very remarkable finding. The question now is this decline at these very low levels of lead consistent with a decline in cardiovascular disease rates? So this is now again the curve of cardiovascular disease events for participants in the study, in the placebo group. And now let's look at what happened. These findings were just released in the American College of Cardiology. And if we look at what happens among those with the EDTA placebo chelation, you can see that there is a small improvement, especially once you complete your treatment, which is happening during the first few months of the study. So there is a small improvement, and the hazard ratio is 0.93, but it's not statistically significant. Remember that the lead levels in the study were extremely low in the new TACT2. In the previous TACT2, when lead exposure was actually higher in the US, the decline, the improvement was significant, statistically significant, and consistent with this removal of lead being beneficial when lead exposure is substantial. So this matters because lead remains a major concern in the 21st century. There are numerous sources of exposure relevant globally through toys, pottery, old housing, herbal products and spices, cosmetics, water pipes, tobacco products, and contaminated soils and food crops, and many others. Lead wheel weights and acid lead batteries remain in use. There is, of course, the burden of past exposures. For anybody born in the US before 1919 still have a high burden of lead in their bodies. And lead production continues globally. It's not that we have reduced lead production. So this signifies this is an important question today. So the social and clinical impact is something that we need to keep working on it. And hopefully this body of work help us add the mitigation of lead exposure as a new critical strategy for cardiovascular disease prevention. And I think that's it. And let me stop sharing so that we can ask questions or move to the next presentation.
Thank you so much. That was a really great briefing, particularly for those of us non-science types on how lead affects cardiovascular disease. It tees us up to have Bjorn talk about taking that primer that you gave us and turning it into how it affects people globally. So Bjorn, if you could go ahead and get your camera back on and unmute yourself. And then Sarah, if you can load up his slides, and Bjorn, we're going to turn it over to you and just have you take it from there.
Okay, well, good morning to many of you. Good afternoon, perhaps good evening, at least to those who are in my part of the world. Anna, thank you. That's a fascinating presentation. So interesting and important to learn how lead is really affecting the various aspects of the cardiovascular system and so on. And what we have done here, this next slide, please. So this is work that I've done with my colleague Ernesto Sanchez-Triana at the World Bank. And what we have done is take Anna presented for cardiovascular disease, as well as evidence of cognitive effects on children. And we have then estimated what it means globally in terms of overall disease burden and cognitive losses in children on a global basis. So this work was published last year in the Lancet Planetary Health. Next, please. So what was contribution of this research? It presented for the first time IQ losses in children in terms of the whole population of children under 5 years in low and middle income countries and in high income countries. So this is the first time of a global estimate of IQ losses in children. Then also for the first time, we present the global cardiovascular disease mortality from lead exposure beyond effects through blood pressure, through the various ways that lead is affecting the cardiovascular system as Anna presented. And then we provide some global cost estimates to these health effects. And so why do we focus on IQ loss? Just a second. Is there some way to... I can't see my whole screen. Okay, let me see. There we go. Thank you. So why do we focus on these two health outcomes? One is because the IQ loss is is a well-recognized indicator of cognitive impairment. We have models based on empirical evidence that allows us to estimate these IQ losses, and as well as for cardiovascular disease. But we should also recognize that there are many other effects of lead, in terms of health effects. Next, please. So what we used was basically estimates of blood lead levels from the Global Burden of Disease 2019. These estimates are based on available studies of blood lead levels, measurements of blood lead levels globally, as well as the model that Global Burden of Disease derived based on these available studies that allowed an estimate for countries where there are just simply haven't been any blood lead level measurements. And we tested also the sensitivity of our estimates to changes in blood lead levels, given the fact that not all countries have blood lead level measurement studies. Now, the global burden of disease blood lead level estimates indicate that blood lead levels on average were 3.5 times higher in low and middle income countries than in high income countries. So that's very substantial. And based on these estimates, we estimate that blood level estimates, we estimate that 28% of children and adults in low and middle income countries may have blood level exceeding as much as 10 microgram per DL per deciliter. And as many as 46, almost half of children and adults in low and middle income countries may have blood lead levels above 5 microgram per deciliter. So let's now see the significance of this in terms of global health effects. Next, please. So for IQ losses, we relied back in 2005, Lanfer and colleagues, they estimated the relationship between blood lead levels and IQ loss by pooling 7 international studies. So this pooling of blood lead level measurements in relation to IQ is really what is standing there today also as the most authoritative estimate of this relationship. And it was redone by Crump and colleagues in 2013. And so we rely on this. So you can see that in the left chart, you see this relationship. So for example, at 4.6 microgram per DL, as is the average blood lead level in low and middle income countries, the indicative IQ loss on average is about 5 IQ points or so quite significant. Globally, we estimated that there was a loss of 765 million IQ points globally in a single year, 2019, among children under 5. Now, the significance of this estimate is that it is about 80% higher than the previous estimate, which dates back in 2013 and relied on blood level measurement data before that time. So we find that actually the the IQ losses are much higher, even at lower average blood lead levels than was used by the previous study by Athena and Trasanda in 2013. The reason for the difference in estimate is really how the relationship between blood lead levels and IQ loss was derived. Athena and Trasanda uses a very conservative approach, while we use an approach that recognizes that IQ losses takes place even at very low levels of exposure. Next, please. So 95% of the global IQ loss in 2019 occurred in low and middle income countries. So that's where really most of the burden is today. And the average child loses nearly 6 IQ points over the first years of life. This IQ loss results in our estimate to about 12% of lifetime income based on empirical relationship between IQ and lifetime income. Now, what does this mean, this 6 IQ points? So it means that, for example, you see in the next point here, that it implies that the population with IQ over 120 points is reduced by about 50%. So as a consequence of lead exposure, countries are losing a lot of valuable intelligence. This is the best way we can kind of present this. The cost of this IQ loss in a single year, 2019, was equivalent to 2.2% of GDP in low and middle income countries, ranging from 1.2 in high income countries to 8.3% of GDP in low income countries. Next, please. I want to point out here that this estimate is likely to be quite conservative because lead exposure, children's lead exposure, have many health effects. We only estimated the IQ loss. Lead exposure has also been found to cause adverse birth outcomes, contribute to stunting, other cognitive impacts, behavioral impacts, that all affect the child through its, adult life in terms of schooling and learning outcomes, labor force participation rates, lifetime earnings, that all affect the lifetime income and the human capital. So if we put this in a human capital perspective, that is, of course, extremely important for economic development. We see major impacts here of lead. Next, please. Now over to cardiovascular disease mortality. So what we did, we relied on a study by Brown and colleagues from 2020. Brown and colleagues developed a continuous health impact model that provided a continuous risk function relationship, a risk relationship between lead exposure and the risk of cardiovascular disease mortality. And they did that on the basis of 4 large studies from the United States that you see in the left chart. These are not the only studies. There are many more studies that have documented the effect from or found an effect of blood lead levels and cardiovascular disease mortality. But these 4 provided an opportunity to establish a continuous risk function that we could use. So, for example, if we look at the 2 studies in the middle, Lanfer and colleagues 2019 and Ruiz and Hernandez 2017, studies that also Anna was referring to, we see in the middle chart here that at the blood levels, the average blood lead levels in low and middle income countries, these studies indicate that the increase in risk of cardiovascular disease mortality is about 50% from this blood lead levels, average blood lead levels. These are the 2 studies we used for our global estimates of cardiovascular disease mortality, because these 2 studies best coincide with blood lead levels around the world today. They relied also on heinous data dating back some time. So for that reason, they correspond best to the situation in the world today. And to the very right, you see the risk function that result from using the 2 studies by Ruiz Hernandez and colleagues and Lanfer and colleagues. The solid line is the central estimate, and we also calculated within the 95% confidence interval the mortality effects of blood lead level or lead exposure. Next, please. So what's the result? So let's take a first look at the left chart. The left chart presents to you the number of deaths in millions in 2019 from major environmental risk factors according to the global burden of disease. So we all know that the global burden of disease is the most authoritative source of these kind of estimates, very comprehensive, very thorough and detailed. And you see here how lead exposure was the fourth, well, the smallest risk factor for cardiovascular disease or death among the four. 0.9 million deaths from lead exposure. Most of that, almost all of it, is cardiovascular disease mortality. Now, to the right, you see our new estimate. We get that, using the methodology that I explained, we get that 5.5 million people died from cardiovascular disease mortality, or just died from cardiovascular disease in 2019. So about 6 times more than the global burden of disease. Since 2019, global burden of disease, 2021, I think, estimated mortality at 1.6 million, using very much the same methodology as before, but making changes to the lower bound for which we can expect cardiovascular disease effects of lead exposure. That's the main change. So that they came out to 1.6 million in 2021. So still 3 times lower than our estimate. So I'll explain that a little later. Next, please. Oh, by the way, so we see here that now with our new estimates, death from lead exposure in terms of cardiovascular disease is higher than even PM2.5 ambient air pollution. So it gives a completely new perspective on the danger of lead in today's world. This was, lead was kind of an ignored risk factor. It was kind of forgotten. But these estimates put everything under completely new lights. Next, please. Now, and our estimate maybe, from some perspectives, may be conservative. Our mortality estimate, cardiovascular disease mortality estimate. That is because the studies by Lanfer and Ruiz Hernandez, they control for blood pressure in their estimate of cardiovascular disease mortality. It means that our estimates do not account for the effect of lead through blood pressure on cardiovascular disease mortality. So that makes our estimate conservative from this perspective. Moreover, our estimate may also be conservative because there may be significant non-cardiovascular disease mortality, as indicated by several large studies in the US, including Lanfer and colleagues 2019. Several studies have pointed to this, that there are other mortality effects as well that we have not counted for. We chose not to use all-cause mortality as an indicator because the structure of mortality varies so much across the world. So we wanted to use the cause-specific mortality to the extent we can, focus on cardiovascular disease. But it may mean that our estimate is conservative. Next, please. Here is the estimate of costs. So back in 2022, we published a report at the World Bank of the cost of PM2.5 air pollution. The cost is based on estimated death by global burden of disease. And we came to the cost of being about $8 trillion in international dollars. International dollars is basically US dollars adjusted for purchasing power parity around the world, so we can more compare across countries. So $8 trillion. You see that in the left chart in the blue-orange, okay? This covers both ambient and household air pollution from the use of solid fuels, which is a major cause of health effects too. Lead exposure, we estimate, have a cost of $10 trillion, so even larger than the combined cost of ambient and household PM2.5 air pollution. This is huge. So the cost of lead exposure is both the IQ losses, the cost of IQ losses, as well as the welfare cost of premature mortality, the premature cardiovascular disease mortality. All right, the one in the middle just expresses this as a percentage of GDP, or purchasing power parity adjusted GDP. And you see the cost of lead exposure close to 8% of global GDP. To the right, you see the global cost as a percentage of GDP by country income classification. So the highest cost is in low-income country, nearly 12% of GDP. And the cost is lowest in high-income countries. We also see, you see the difference in dark blue and light blue. So what you see is that in low-income countries, the IQ losses represents the largest share of total cost, larger than the cost of mortality. While as you climb up the income ladder in upper middle income countries and high income countries, most of the cost is mortality. And the reason for this is that in low income countries, you have high birth rates, a large share of the population, or largest share of the population is children under 5 years, and therefore high IQ losses, while they have lower rates or baseline rates of cardiovascular disease mortality. They're less vulnerable to that. While in the upper middle income and high income, you have more aging populations that are more vulnerable, more susceptible to cardiovascular disease. So therefore, the cardiovascular disease mortality dominates. Okay, next, please. Anna has talked much about this. The only thing I want to say here is that our estimate of cardiovascular disease mortality represents about 30% globally of all cardiovascular disease mortality. So 30% of it is associated with lead exposure. And this is very new, very significant. And it means that lead exposure may therefore be the third largest risk factor for cardiovascular disease mortality, only exceeded by high blood pressure and dietary risks. Yes, next, please. So, okay, now we look at something important. We want to look at this lead exposure in the context of the disease transition in low and middle income countries. So what has happened over the last 40 years, 30 years, in low and middle income countries? We see a huge decline in death rates from communicable diseases, maternal, neonatal, nutritional causes, okay, by 60%. While the non-communicable disease death rates have increased. And of the non-communicable diseases, the cardiovascular disease mortality is almost half. So it's a huge share of it. And that has increased, okay? So we have made huge achievements. The world has made huge achievements over the last 30 years to reduce mortality in children, in their mothers, and nutritional, etc. While we have not made so much progress in terms of cardiovascular disease. Next, please.
Bjorn,
But where has the money gone? Where has all the money gone for health? In fact, the development assistance for health reached $46 billion in 2021. For the non-communicable diseases, it was only 1.1 billion, 2.4%. So almost no money has gone to the health areas that has been increasing over the 30 years. Most of it has gone to that area, of course, where we have made a lot of progress. So this allocation needs to change in order to be able to combat where we see growing health burden in low and middle income countries. Next, please. What are the priorities here? First of all, we need to institutionalize routine blood level measurements in, for example, DHS and mixed surveys, okay? DHS is USAID and mixed service by UNICEF. We need to include blood level measurements. So we have good data on the exposure in low and middle income countries. We need to have source identification, find out where does the lead come from. We need to do exposure assessment to understand how these sources are determining blood lead levels. And there are several elements of approaching this, and Pure Earth is working hard on this, and that's home-based assessments, household questionnaires, and as well as also lead measurements of food, especially in some developing countries. We suspect that this could be a major source of lead exposure. And importantly, we need to find solutions to prevent heavy metal contamination of recycled aluminum cookware production. And we need to control the emissions, lead emissions from used lead acid battery recycling. Most batteries are recycled, car batteries, etc., are recycled. And we need to prevent that this continues just polluting the air, water, and soil. Next, please.
Great.
So that concludes the presentation. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you so much, Bjorn. Look, unfortunately, we're gonna lose Anna here in just a couple of minutes. She's got something else to run to. Anna, there were a couple of questions that came up that I think are specific to you. One in the chat was just about the question about the bone screening and how do you measure it? I think you said to use an XRF scanner.
Yeah, XRF K-shell XRF technology, which in the way it was done in that study, it's with relatively burdensome because it's a device that was not portable. Now there is new portable technology that could allow that type of research in epidemiological studies in a little bit an easier way, but it's still difficult. So that's why generally we rely on blood lead biomarkers.
Right.
The second question I just saw, it's in the Q&A, yes?
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, and so this is a very interesting question. And as you could see, yes, in this trial, in the TAC2 trial, yes, we can lower blood lead levels, but the blood lead levels to start with were extremely low, were much lower. And this is because this is now in the US. After 2016, participants were recruited. And even in the risk estimates that Bjorn has been showing us and all the previous studies in NHANES, blood lead levels were much higher. They were in the previous NHANES decades. They were more similar to what's happening in globally in other countries today. So I believe that, yes, this might be a primary reason why we see these kind of different results. The original TAC study, the original trial was done when lead exposure was still higher in the US. So we were able to see a bigger benefit. While now at these very, very low levels of lead exposure, yes, we can reduce lead with EDTA chelation, but the cardiovascular benefit is smaller. Yeah.
On that, and I know you have just a minute, but in lower and middle income countries where you have kids with really high blood lead levels, is chelation therapy even an option in low income contexts?
Yes, I would say for adults, I would say the question could be, yes, it's very safe. We have lots of data on safety. For children, the only concern with chelation, you need to make very clear, you need to make sure that you have adequate mineral supplementation at the same time as you would do the chelation, because there could be a concern with the essential elements that could be chelated too. So I think making sure there is sufficient supplementation. So honestly, without research, I would not feel confident to make that recommendation. That's why reducing exposure, making sure we remove lead from the sources that are happening, I think is really, really important nowadays, and our efforts should go in that direction.
Right. And then maybe one other question. There's something in the chat. What is calcium supplementation?
We know that people who have adequate calcium intake absorb less lead into their bodies. So adequate nutritional status is going to be very important. So adequate nutrition and making sure people have adequate calcium intake, it's important to mitigate and reduce the absorption of lead into the body. So that's correct.
Great.
And iron, the other one is iron. Calcium and iron, it's very important to reduce lead absorption.
All right. So thank you. I know we've kept you longer than we were supposed to. We really appreciate your participation in this, and thank you so much for your great work.
Thank you, everybody. Amazing effort. Thank you.
All right. So Bjorn, that leaves you. I have one question for you, and then there's a question in there on policy recommendations that in the Q&A that you might take on. I had a question about averages. I've talked about the tyranny of averages because you mentioned there's an average of an average blood level of 4.6 in lower and middle income countries, but that's not uniform, right? So you have some kids who have low blood levels, and then some kids whose blood levels are through the roof. So I could just talk a little bit about, you have the averages, and then you have really affected populations, what your research says that does to kids with really high blood lead levels, or adults for that matter. Do you get my point?
Yes, I did, Mark. As we saw on one of my slides, we estimate that about 28% of children and adults have blood lead levels over 10 microgram per deciliter. So now we're starting to talk about levels that even was of a great concern even 10 or 20 years ago, before we properly understood how lead also have health effects at very, very low levels of exposure or very low blood lead levels. So yes, this average of 4.6, it hides a lot of realities. There are great variations across countries for various reasons, and within countries there are even greater variations. But to get an accurate picture on this, we need to have systematic, routine, nationally representative blood level measurement studies to even just be able to get a better understanding of this. My sense is that we have lost a couple of decades. I would say it's that severe, because we thought that by getting rid of lead in gasoline, we have solved the problem. We have in fact kind of lost a couple of decades in our understanding and of the sources of lead, how they contribute to blood lead levels, each of these sources, and how to best address it. So we are 20, 30 years behind where we are today on, let's say, PM2.5 air pollution. We have a lot of catch up to do. On PM2.5 air pollution, we have a pretty good understanding, and we have methodologies, to do source apportionment studies and get a sense of what sector contribute the most, to population exposure. We are not there yet. We are many, many years behind. It's really time to recognize the realities and speed up things.
Yeah, and maybe just following on that, and I know you're
and Mark, I just want to say there that as the one slide I presented is that how little money has been allocated to the biggest chunk of disease burden. Most have been concentrated, and when you go back to 1990, yes, of course we wanted to make sure we could address issues of child mortality and nutritional and so on, and we spend a lot of money on it, and we made huge progress. But it's time to start concentrating on this other disease burden that also lead is contributing to, that has almost received no funding.
Yeah, thank you for that. maybe just to take the last few minutes, I know you had a slide on this, but just expound a little bit. And I understand that these are your, these are your positions, not necessarily the World Bank's or anybody else's, but just from your research and your experience, expound a little on the policy recommendations that you talked about to address lead exposure and begin to lower blood lead levels.
Yeah, I mean, of course, first of all, we have to have a better understanding of what are the blood lead levels around the world. Without that, we're kind of fumbling in the dark. So we got to do something. And fortunately, organizations have started, right? So we had UNICEF in Georgia included it in their mixed survey, in the national survey. So that was a great step forward. UNICEF will do the same in Bangladesh, a country of 170 million people with very high blood lead levels, as indicated by smaller studies. So this is the first step in the right direction, and USAID is supporting UNICEF's efforts. So this is really great that somebody's stepping up to the plate here and really get something done. Then we need to continue. We need to continue the great work that Pure Earth is doing on source identification. We need to have larger samples, in my view, on home-based assessment so that we can do more exposure assessment, not just find out what are the sources, but how each of these sources are contributing to blood lead levels, just as we do when it comes to air pollution, right? We want to understand how much each source emission source is contributing to population exposure to PM2.5. We want the same understanding on lead. We need to stop the informal recycling of batteries because it's just a continuation of lead pollution that just continues. 95% of all lead batteries are recycled. Almost every battery is recycled, and that's great, but it's done in a way that massively pollutes the environment in low and middle income countries.
Yeah, I think I saw a statistic that half of all recycling was done in informal and improper context.
Yeah, so this got to stop. We got to do something about that. And it's a complex problem because they're very small scale, they move quickly, they can stop and move. It's employment and household income issues about restricting their activities. So, there's a lot of kind of, political economy type of considerations too, to be able to do something. But this got to stop.
Yeah, I agree with all of those. All right, listen, you have stayed up late and I really appreciate it. We are going to wrap up, but thank you so much. We'd like to share your presentation and honors with the group, if that's okay with you all.
That's fine.
We'll get links to that. This session was recorded, so we'll have the whole session posted on YouTube at some point, and we'll share that link with all the attendees and the registrants. And I just want to thank you again for staying up late and presenting this incredible research to us. It really does point to the fact that although we've made great progress in lowering child mortality over the past 30 years, we do need to think about child thriving. And addressing lead poisoning is critical, not just to children, but to entire economies. So your research really points that out, and we thank you so much for taking the time to share it with us.
Thank you. My pleasure. You're welcome.
All right. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. We'll be in touch.